Hello, my name is Harmon Chavla. Thank you for joining us for our ongoing lecture series on ventilator management. And today we will actually be discussing the various spontaneous modes of ventilation. So with this, we'll start off with the Puritan Bennett 980, just kind of going over the screen, what the screen outline is. It just happens to be the ventilator that we use in our institution. However, if there is a desire to have other ventilators discussed, including the Servo-I or Avea, you can reach out to us and we'll happily provide those. After that, we'll talk about the different components of the breath. Just another refresher in terms of what goes into the breath from a ventilator. And then we'll actually discuss how various spontaneous modes have differences in what the patient controls as opposed to what is determined by the ventilator and the settings that are dialed in. And then we'll finish it off with an example. So with this, we'll start off with the Puritan Bennett screen. And again, with the Puritan Bennett screen, we're going to really focus quite a bit on the lower portion of the screen just for right now. Now, as you can tell, we are selected into a spontaneous mode, which is where this is in the bottom left corner. And when we actually look at it, we'll go over the various settings of the pressure support, which here is dictated with a 0 number, the flow sensitivity, the fraction of inspired oxygen, as well as the PEEP, which in this instance is dialed in at 5. So let's talk about the components of the breath one more time. The rate refers to how many times a patient breathes in 1 minute, how many breaths are delivered in that minute. Now it's important to remember that this rate is dialed in on the ventilator generally, and it is the minimum number of breaths that the patient takes. If the patient wishes to take more, there's generally an arm of ventilator management that really reflects what those additional breaths on top will get in terms of support. The TI is also known as the inspiratory time. It dictates how long a patient will breathe in for. On our ventilator, what's labeled P-sup is also known as pressure support, and this is for the breaths that are set above the rate. How much pressure support will you have delivered, or if you're just on a spontaneous mode like pressure support, it dictates how much pressure support you get above PEEP anytime a breath is triggered. Now, going over to that trigger, that's really dictated by V-sense, also known as your flow sensitivity. How much flow does the patient have to pull through the ventilator to trigger a breath? And another way of thinking about it is how much air needs to move through that circuitry before the ventilator realizes, oh, the patient's trying to take a breath, let's help them provide one. And then, of course, the last one is the rise time. It's actually the rate at which the ventilator will achieve the targeted pressure. So when we are in these spontaneous modes, we have to try to figure out what the patient controls and what the ventilator controls. So we'll start off with the most basic one, which is the rate of breathing. How many times does the patient breathe in a minute? And in a spontaneous mode, the patient will dictate how many times they want to breathe in any given minute. And so that is purely controlled by the patient. Now, the only caveat to that is if the patient goes apneic, there are fail-safes within the ventilator to keep any harm from befalling the patient, and so there is a backup rate that's inherently built into the ventilator itself. The next setting is the I time. You'll notice that there's no way to dial in a rate or an I time on the screen on the Puritan Bennett for spontaneous modes, and that's because the patient's going to dictate how long they breathe in for and how long they're going to hold that breath in. The next variable that we'll look at is the P-sup, also known as the pressure support. And in this instance, the ventilator will determine how much pressure support will be delivered per breath. And when we look at the next one, which is V-sense or flow sensitivity, it's something that the provider or the ventilator really selects how much flow needs to be pulled through the circuitry before the ventilator detects a breath. So that's another way of saying that is once a certain amount of volume goes through the circuitry, the ventilator knows, hey, the patient's trying to take a breath. I will provide this much pressure support to them, and that pressure support amount is something that's pre-selected by the physician. And then the last one is the PEEP, or the peak end expiratory pressure. This is again something that's dialed in on the ventilator, so the ventilator itself selects the pressure at the end of exhalation that's remained within the closed circuit. So when we look at this example, and again I just kind of pulled the image that we had from the very beginning, this patient is on a spontaneous mode of ventilation, and when we look at the spontaneous mode again, it's picked up right here. The patient is just on CPAP without any pressure support. So if you look at this P-sup reading here, it's actually listed here as 0. And what that basically means is every time a ventilator breath is triggered, when 0.3 liters per minute are moved through the circuitry, there's actually no support on inhalation. The patient actually isn't getting any additional ventilator support. What is selected is the end expiratory pressure, which is the PEEP. So at the end of the breath, when the patient exhales, there's 5 centimeters of water pressure that's left within the tubing. So this patient here will basically be breathing on their own. They'll dictate how many times per minute they breathe. They will generate their own pressures within the lung when they take a breath in, but when they breathe out, they will breathe out to a pressure of 5 centimeters of water pressure. So in reality, for this patient specifically, even if they were taking breaths in, the flow trigger that we have here isn't really triggering a pressure supported breath. So this, for all intents and purposes of this example, is not really a value that the patient is even using. That is the end of our talk on spontaneous modes. We do welcome any questions. And again, as it goes with ventilators, the more times you expose yourself to the ventilator, the more times you actually wind up going in and working with the ventilator, the easier the understanding of it becomes. Thank you so much.